The Crown and Anchor, Manchester, Monday, July 7th, 2025, 1:45 p.m. The most exclusive restaurant in England buzzed with the quiet conversations of millionaires and aristocrats, the gentle clink of expensive crystal, and the subtle aromas of dishes that cost more than most people earned in a week. Tyson Fury sat at the corner table, his massive frame somehow fitting elegantly into the restaurant's refined atmosphere. Across from him, three executives from Sky Sports spread documents worth £50 million across the white linen tablecloth. The retired heavyweight champion was finalizing the most lucrative television contract in British sports broadcasting history. "Mr. Fury, this really is unprecedented," said Marcus Pemberton, Sky Sports head of programming, adjusting his gold-rimmed spectacles. £50 million for exclusive rights to your life story, documentary series and future commentary work. You'll be set for generations. Tyson nodded, his attention momentarily caught by the restaurant's opulent surroundings. Persian rugs covered polished hardwood floors, crystal chandeliers cast warm light over mahogany-paneled walls, and every table held arrangements of fresh orchids that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. The clientele matched the decor's extravagance. Reginald Ashworth, a property magnate worth £300 million, sat nearby with his wife Evangeline Thornfield, discussing their latest acquisition of a Scottish castle. At another table, Bartholomew Sinclair, one of London's most ruthless corporate lawyers, entertained Cordelia Bramwell, an heiress whose family owned half of Yorkshire. Nigel Pembroke Smith, the restaurant's owner and a man who took pride in serving only Britain's elite, glided between tables with the smooth efficiency of someone who had built his reputation on exclusivity. His establishment was legendary for its waiting list, its astronomical prices, and most importantly, its absolute refusal to serve anyone who didn't meet his exacting standards of wealth and social standing. "The documentary will cover your entire career," continued Sarah Williams, Sky's documentary director. "From your early struggles with mental health to your rise to become the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. It's a story that needs to be told." Fury was about to respond when a commotion near the restaurant's entrance caught his attention. The maitre d', a thin man named Geoffrey, was engaged in what appeared to be an increasingly heated conversation with someone just out of view. "Sir, I'm afraid you cannot enter without proper attire," Geoffrey's voice carried across the dining room, his tone dripping with disdain. A figure stepped into view, a man in his late 30s, clearly homeless by all appearances. His clothes were dirty and torn, his hair unkempt, and his weathered face spoke of too many nights spent sleeping rough. But something about his posture, the way he held himself despite his obvious poverty, suggested a dignity that even desperate circumstances couldn't entirely diminish. "Please," the man said, his voice carrying a slight Scottish accent that was barely audible across the dining room. "I'm not asking for charity, just some food. I haven't eaten in 2 days." The conversations at nearby tables began to falter as diners turned to observe the spectacle. Several pulled out their phones either to record or to call security. Nigel Pembroke Smith appeared as if summoned by some invisible alarm, his face flushed with indignation. At 52, he was a man who had built his empire on the principle that certain people simply didn't belong in certain places, and he intended to maintain those standards at all costs. "How dare you!" Nigel's voice boomed across the restaurant, causing every conversation to stop entirely. "How dare you enter my establishment looking like that?" The homeless man, who would later identify himself as James McConnell, took a step back but didn't flee. "Sir, I understand I don't look presentable, but I'm simply asking for some food. I can work for it, clean dishes, anything." "Work?" Nigel's laugh was cruel and theatrical, performed for his wealthy audience. "You think we would allow someone like you to touch anything in our kitchen? Do you have any idea what kind of establishment this is?" The elite clientele watched with a mixture of fascination and disgust. Evangeline Thornfield whispered loudly enough for others to hear, "Honestly, the nerve of some people. Doesn't he realize where he is?" Reginald Ashworth nodded in agreement. "And Nigel, you should charge admission just to watch how you handle this riffraff." "Listen carefully, you worthless vagrant," Nigel continued, his voice growing louder and more vicious with each word. "This restaurant serves the most important people in Manchester, members of Parliament, business leaders, aristocracy. We have standards that people like you could never hope to understand." James McConnell's shoulders sagged slightly, but he tried once more. "Please, sir, I'm a veteran. I served in Afghanistan. I don't care if you served on the moon." Nigel interrupted, his face now bright red. "Look at yourself. You're dirty, you smell, and you're disturbing my customers. Security." Two large men in dark suits appeared from the restaurant's back rooms, moving purposefully toward James. The homeless veteran looked around desperately, his eyes scanning the faces of the wealthy diners, searching for even a glimmer of compassion. It was then that his gaze fell upon Tyson Fury. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Recognition flickered in James's eyes, followed immediately by something that looked like hope. He took a tentative step toward Fury's table, ignoring the approaching security guards. "Excuse me," James said, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the suddenly silent restaurant. "Mr. Fury? I'm sorry to bother you, but could you spare just £5 for food? I promise I'll leave immediately after." The entire restaurant held its breath. Every eye was now fixed on the table where Britain's most famous athlete sat with his multi-million-pound contract spread before him. Nigel Pembroke Smith seized the moment with theatrical fury. "Now you're harassing my customers. That's it. Get him out of here immediately." But as the security guards moved closer, James McConnell spoke again, this time looking directly into Tyson Fury's eyes with an intensity that cut through everything else in the room. "Kandahar," he said quietly. 2014. Corporal Fury, do you remember me?" The pen in Tyson's hand stopped moving. His entire body went rigid, as if struck by lightning. The color drained from his face as memories came flooding back with devastating clarity. Afghanistan, Helmand Province, a different life, before the fame, before the fortune, before the world knew his name. A young soldier named Tyson Fury, serving his country in one of the most dangerous places on earth. The sound of an explosion, the acrid smell of smoke and burning metal, pain shooting through his leg as shrapnel tore through his combat gear. And then, through the chaos and confusion, a voice with a Scottish accent calling his name, strong arms lifting him, carrying him to safety, while bullets whined overhead. Sergeant James McConnell, the man who had saved his life. Tyson rose slowly from his chair, his 6'9" frame unfolding like a mountain emerging from the earth. The restaurant fell into absolute silence as every person present realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. "Jock," Tyson said, his voice barely a whisper but carrying clearly in the stunned quiet. "Jesus Christ, Jock, is that really you?" The security guards stopped in their tracks, uncertain how to proceed, when their target was clearly known to the restaurant's most famous patron. Nigel Pembroke Smith, sensing that the situation was spiraling beyond his control, tried to maintain his authority. "Mr. Fury, I assure you, we'll handle this vagrant appropriately." "You needn't concern yourself." "Vagrant?" The word exploded from Tyson's lips like a gunshot. "Vagrant?" The heavyweight champion turned to face Nigel with an expression that had struck fear into the hearts of the world's toughest fighters. "You ignorant, arrogant piece of shit. Do you know who this man is?" The restaurant seemed to shrink around Nigel as Tyson's voice rose. "This vagrant is Sergeant James McConnell, and he saved my life in Afghanistan when I was bleeding out in the middle of a goddamn battlefield." A collective gasp went up from the assembled diners. Phones that had been discreetly recording were now openly pointed at the unfolding drama. Cressida Blackwood, a journalist from the Manchester Evening News who had been dining quietly in the corner, began furiously taking notes. This was no longer just a wealthy man's dinner. This was a story that would be on the front page of every newspaper in Britain by morning. Tyson stepped around the table, moving toward James with purpose. "Jock, what the hell happened to you, mate? How did you end up?" "It's a long story, Tyson," James replied, his voice heavy with years of accumulated pain. "But right now, I'm just embarrassed that you had to see me like this." "Embarrassed?" Fury's voice cracked with emotion. "You saved my bloody life and you're worried about being embarrassed?" The transformation in the restaurant's atmosphere was complete. What had begun as an evening of elite dining and business deals had become something entirely different, a reckoning that none of the wealthy patrons had anticipated. Nigel Pembroke Smith, realizing the magnitude of his error, attempted to salvage the situation. "Mr. Fury, obviously if I had known about your connection to this gentleman, I would have handled things differently. Perhaps we could arrange a meal for him in the kitchen." "The kitchen?" Tyson's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "You want to feed the man who saved my life in your fucking kitchen like he's some kind of stray dog?" The silence that followed was deafening. Even the restaurant's background music seemed to have stopped, as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Tyson looked around the room, taking in the faces of Manchester's elite, people who had never known real hardship, never felt genuine fear, never had to rely on the courage of others for their very survival. Then he looked back at James McConnell, the homeless veteran who had once been the bravest man he had ever known. "Octavia," he called to his assistant, who had been quietly observing from a nearby table. "Get my lawyer on the phone. Now." "Boss, Octavia Harrington looked confused. "Call Henderson, tell him I need him here immediately. And call the bank, I want to know exactly how much cash I can access today." Nigel's face went white as understanding began to dawn. "Mr. Fury, surely we can resolve this like gentlemen." "Gentlemen?" Tyson laughed, but there was no humor in it. "There's only one gentleman in this room, Nigel, and you just tried to throw him out on the street." The heavyweight champion turned to address the entire restaurant, his voice carrying to every corner of the stunned establishment. "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce you to real courage. This man, James McConnell, carried me 3 kilometers through enemy fire when I was wounded in Afghanistan. He risked his own life to save mine without hesitation, without thought of reward, because that's what real men do for each other." He gestured toward the assembled diners. "How many of you have ever put your life on the line for someone else? How many of you have ever faced real danger, real sacrifice? Because this man has, and today you watched him be treated like garbage for having the audacity to ask for food." The shame in the room was palpable. Several diners couldn't meet Fury's eyes, staring instead at their expensive meals that suddenly seemed meaningless. "Well," Tyson continued, his voice growing stronger, "that ends today. Jock, my friend, you're not just going to eat here, you're going to own this place." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, and in that moment, everyone in the Crown and Anchor knew they were witnessing something that would change everything. The silence that followed Tyson's declaration was so complete that the ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner seemed to echo like gunshots. Every face in the Crown and Anchor wore the same expression of stunned disbelief, as if the laws of physics had suddenly been suspended and gravity was working in reverse. Nigel Pembroke Smith's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. You can't be serious, Mr. Fury. This is my restaurant, my life's work. You can't just—" "Watch me," Tyson interrupted, his voice carrying the same cold determination that had made him unstoppable in the boxing ring. "Octavia, is Henderson on his way?" Octavia Harrington, still recovering from the shock of the situation, nodded quickly. "He'll be here in 20 minutes, boss. And the bank confirmed you have immediate access to £15 million. A collective gasp went up from the assembled diners. £15 million was more money than most of them saw in a lifetime, and Tyson was talking about it as casually as ordering a cup of tea. Bartholomew Sinclair, the corporate lawyer, stood up from his table with the confidence of a man accustomed to being the smartest person in any room. "Mr. Fury, with all due respect, you can't simply force someone to sell their business. There are laws, procedures." "Are there?" Tyson turned his attention to the lawyer with an expression that could have melted steel. "And what about the laws regarding discrimination against veterans? What about the procedures for treating war heroes with basic human dignity?" Sinclair faltered slightly, but pressed on. "That's entirely different. Mr. Pembroke Smith has the right to refuse service to anyone he chooses. Not anymore, he doesn't." Tyson's voice grew louder. "Because in about 20 minutes, this place is going to have a new owner. Someone who understands what real service means." James McConnell, overwhelmed by the rapidly escalating situation, tried to intervene. "Tyson, mate, this is too much. You don't need to do this for me. I'll just go." "You're not going anywhere, Jock." Fury placed a protective hand on his old comrade's shoulder. "You've spent God knows how many years being invisible, being ignored, being treated like you don't matter. Well, today that changes. Today, everyone in Manchester is going to learn your name and remember what you did." Reginald Ashworth, his face flushed with indignation, couldn't contain himself any longer. "This is absolutely preposterous. You can't waltz in here and destroy a man's livelihood just because you're having some sort of emotional breakdown." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as Tyson slowly turned to face the property magnate. "Emotional breakdown? Is that what you call it when someone stands up for a war hero?" "I call it an overreaction to a simple misunderstanding," Ashworth replied, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Surely this whole situation could be resolved with a reasonable donation to some veterans' charity." "A donation?" Tyson's laugh was harsh and bitter. "You think this is about money? You think I can just write a check and make it right that you people treated a man who bled for this country like he was some kind of disease?" Evangeline Thornfield, Ashworth's wife, attempted to defuse the situation with what she clearly believed was wisdom. "Mr. Fury, we all appreciate your loyalty to your friend, but surely you must understand that establishments like this have certain standards to maintain. If we allowed anyone off the street to simply walk in—" "Anyone off the street?" The words came out of Tyson's mouth like venom. "Anyone off the street?" The restaurant trembled under the force of his rage. "This man earned the Military Cross for valor in Afghanistan. He saved the lives of 7 soldiers, including mine. He's got more honor in his little finger than the lot of you have in your entire fucking bodies. Cordelia Bramwell, the young heiress, had remained silent throughout the confrontation, but now she spoke up in a voice trembling with privilege and indignation. Mr. Fury, I think you're being terribly unfair. We had no way of knowing about this man's background. All we saw was someone who appeared to be, well, homeless. And that made it acceptable to treat him like an animal. Tyson's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. Because he was homeless, he deserved to be humiliated? Because he was poor? He wasn't worthy of basic human decency? The young woman's face crumpled under his gaze. I didn't mean... Yes, you did mean it. You all meant it. Tyson looked around the room, making eye contact with each of the wealthy diners. Every single one of you watched a man beg for food and felt nothing but disgust. You saw someone who had fallen on hard times and decided he was beneath your notice. Nigel Pembroke Smith, desperate to regain control of the situation, tried a different approach. Mr. Fury, please, let's discuss this rationally. This restaurant has been in my family for 3 generations. It's not just a business, it's a legacy. Surely we can find some other way to help your friend without destroying everything I've built. For a moment, Tyson's expression softened slightly, and Nigel thought he might have found common ground. But then Fury spoke, and his words cut deeper than any physical blow could have. Your legacy, he said quietly. Your legacy is what I just witnessed. 3 generations of your family have built a reputation for serving the wealthy, while turning away anyone who doesn't meet your standards of worthiness. That's what you're proud of. That's what you want to pass on to your children. James McConnell, who had been standing quietly throughout the escalating confrontation, finally found his voice. Tyson, please, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but this isn't necessary. I've been treated worse than this. I can handle it. The simple dignity in his words seemed to break something inside Tyson Fury. Here was a man who had faced enemy fire, who had saved lives, who had served his country with distinction, and he was apologizing for being treated like garbage by people who had never sacrificed anything for anyone. No, Jock, Tyson said, his voice thick with emotion. You shouldn't have to handle it. Nobody should have to handle it. And I'll be damned if I sit here and watch it happen to you again. The sound of car doors slamming outside announced the arrival of Richard Henderson, Tyson's personal lawyer, along with what appeared to be a small army of assistants carrying briefcases and legal documents. Ah, Tyson said with grim satisfaction, the cavalry has arrived. Henderson burst through the restaurant's front door like a man on a mission. At 62, he was one of Britain's most feared corporate lawyers, a man who had made his reputation destroying companies that stood in his client's way. Tyson, what's the situation? Henderson asked without preamble, his sharp eyes taking in the tense atmosphere of the restaurant. Richard, I want to buy this place, today, now, whatever it takes. Henderson's expression didn't change. He had handled stranger requests from his famous client. What's the current valuation? Nigel found himself answering despite his shock. The property is worth approximately £8 million, but the business, the reputation, the client list, it's all irreplaceable. 15 million, Henderson interrupted. Cash, immediate transfer, take it or leave it. You can't do this, Nigel's voice cracked with desperation. This is extortion. This is business, Henderson replied coolly. My client wishes to purchase your establishment, and he's offering nearly double its market value. In any reasonable world, you'd consider this a stroke of incredible good fortune. Bartholomew Sinclair stepped forward again, his legal training finally kicking in. There are procedures, contracts, inspections. This can't all happen today. Henderson turned to look at the corporate lawyer with the expression of a predator sizing up prey. Mr. Sinclair, isn't it? I've heard of your work. Quite good at protecting the interests of the wealthy, I'm told. I do my job, Sinclair replied stiffly. Then you'll understand when I tell you that every document needed for this transaction is being prepared as we speak. My office has been working on acquisition papers since Mr. Fury called 30 minutes ago. The only question is whether Mr. Pembroke Smith wants to walk away from this as a very wealthy man or as someone who'll be fighting lawsuits for the rest of his life. Lawsuits? Nigel's voice was barely a whisper. Discrimination against veterans, violation of the Equality Act, public humiliation of a decorated war hero. Henderson's voice was casual, as if he were discussing the weather. My team can be very creative when properly motivated. The fight went out of Nigel all at once. He slumped into the nearest chair, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. Around the restaurant, the other diners watched in fascination and growing horror as they realized they were witnessing the complete destruction of a man's life's work. This isn't right, Evangeline Thornfield whispered to her husband. This isn't how civilized people behave. But Tyson heard her, and when he responded, his voice carried to every corner of the restaurant. "You're absolutely right," he said. "Civilized people don't humiliate war veterans. Civilized people don't treat human beings like garbage because they're poor or homeless or different. Civilized people show compassion and respect for those who've sacrificed for their freedom." He gestured toward James McConnell, who was still standing uncertainly near the entrance. "That man over there fought for your right to sit in this restaurant and eat food that costs more than most people make in a week. He bled so you could feel safe in your comfortable lives. And when he asked for a simple meal, you watched him be treated like an animal." The shame in the room was so thick it was almost suffocating. Several of the diners had begun quietly gathering their belongings, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the evening had taken. "So no," Tyson continued, "this isn't how civilized people behave. But then again, civilized people wouldn't have allowed what happened here today to occur in the first place." Henderson's assistants had spread documents across 3 tables, working with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. The sound of printers and laptops filled the restaurant as the legal apparatus of acquisition swung into full motion. "Mr. Pembroke Smith," Henderson called out, "we're ready for your signature." Nigel looked around the restaurant one last time, taking in the shocked faces of his customers, the expensive decor that had once been his pride and joy, the legacy that was about to slip through his fingers. "If I refuse?" he asked quietly. "Then we proceed with the alternative legal actions," Henderson replied without emotion, "which, I should mention, would likely result in criminal charges as well as civil penalties." The pen in Nigel's hand trembled as he stared at the documents that would end his ownership of the Crown and Anchor. Around him, his wealthy clientele watched in stunned silence as their world of privilege and exclusivity came crashing down. And in the center of it all stood James McConnell, the homeless veteran who had simply asked for food and inadvertently triggered a revolution. 2 hours later, the legal documents were signed, notarized, and filed. The Crown and Anchor, Manchester's most exclusive restaurant, now belonged to James "Jock" McConnell, a homeless veteran who that morning had been sleeping under a bridge. Nigel Pembroke Smith sat in what had once been his own restaurant, staring at a check for £15 million. Around him, the dining room that had once buzzed with elite conversations now held only a handful of people: Tyson Fury, James McConnell, Henderson the lawyer, and shocked staff members. "I don't understand how this is legal," Nigel said, his voice hollow. Henderson looked up from his documents. "It's perfectly legal, Mr. Pembroke Smith. You've sold your business at an extraordinarily generous price. Mr. McConnell now owns everything. You're free to leave." James stood in the center of the dining room, taking in his new surroundings. The crystal chandeliers, the Persian rugs, the mahogany paneling, all now belonged to a man who an hour ago had been begging for food. "Tyson," he said quietly, "I can't accept this. It's too much." Fury approached his old comrade. "Jock, do you remember what you told me when you were carrying me to the medical chopper in Kandahar?" James's eyes grew distant. "I told you that we look after our own, that no one gets left behind." "That's right, no one gets left behind." Tyson's voice was thick with emotion. "Well, brother, I left you behind for 10 years while I got rich and famous, but not anymore." The restaurant staff had gathered near the kitchen doors, uncertain of their fate. James noticed them and walked over. "I know you're worried about your jobs. Nothing will change for any of you. This restaurant will continue to operate, and you'll all keep your positions if you want them." A young waitress stepped forward hesitantly. "Sir, I want to apologize for earlier. I should have said something when Mr. Pembroke Smith was treating you that way." James smiled gently. "You were just doing your job, love. But from now on, everyone who comes through those doors will be treated with respect, regardless of how they look or how much money they have." "There's something else, Jock," Tyson said, pulling out his phone. "I've been making calls. I want you to meet someone." The front door opened and a woman in her 50s entered, followed by a teenage girl. James's face went white. Emma, Margaret McConnell, his ex-wife, approached cautiously. "Tyson's people called us in Edinburgh. They said you needed us." Emma stepped forward and hugged her father tightly. "I missed you so much, Dad." Tyson watched the family reunion with satisfaction, deeper than any boxing victory. "There's one more thing. I'm establishing an endowment fund. £5 million to cover free meals for veterans indefinitely. Every veteran eats for free, forever." As if summoned by his words, several veterans entered. Word had spread about what had happened. James found himself hosting an impromptu celebration of military service. Nigel finally stood to leave, clutching his check. "Mr. Pembroke Smith," James called out, "you're welcome here any time. The past is the past." "I'm a soldier," James replied simply. "We protect people even when they don't deserve it." 3 months later, The Crown and Anchor had been transformed. It remained an upscale restaurant, but 3 days a week, it opened its doors to veterans for free. On a quiet Tuesday evening, James stood behind the bar. Tyson entered for their weekly dinner. "How's business, boss?" "Better than I imagined," James replied, setting down a pint. "People want to eat here because of what this place represents." "And what's that?" James smiled, looking at the veterans throughout his dining room. "Hope, the idea that nobody gets left behind, no matter how far they fall." Tyson raised his glass. "To keeping promises." "To keeping promises," James agreed. The homeless veteran who had been kicked out of Britain's most exclusive restaurant hadn't just been given food that day. He had been given back his life, his family, and his purpose. And in return, he had given an entire community something they had lost: the knowledge that someone still cared enough to fight for them.